Fellas, considering there's no UFC on this weekend, but there's quite a lot going on in the different promotions, I thought it'd be a perfect time to rank every major MMA promotion outside of the UFC. So I'm going to be ranking them in 4 different categories. Starting off with UFC competitor. It's a solid UFC competitor at the highest level. It's a massive MMA promotion. Going on to it's good when the UFC's off. So if there's no UFC, I might tune into this promotion, but any other circumstance I probably won't. Going on to people watch this, it's doing its thing, it might be useful, but I can't imagine anybody watching this promotion. Onto just awful promotions. These are awful MMA promotions, they're terrible. And we'll go in there with the first awful promotion, which I'm going to say is Eagle FC. Now, after Khabib retired in 2020, he bought Guerrilla Fighting Championship and turned it into Eagle FC in November 2020, like a month after he retired from the sport. And I thought Eagle FC was going to be where all the big Dagestani prospects come from. You know, Khabib's influence. He's just brought this new promotion after retiring. I thought all the Dagestani fighters were going to come over to Eagle FC and make a name for himself. And that wasn't really the case. Apart from maybe Magomed Gadzhizulov and Ikram Aliskerov, and I guess Kevin Lee, who came from the UFC to Eagle FC, they haven't really produced any big names, and I don't even know if they're an active promotion anymore. I mean, since the beginning of 2023, they've had 4 events since 2023, which is insanely inactive for what's supposed to be an active promotion. And I feel like even Khabib has kind of ditched Eagle FC and has focused on coaching his fighters full time. The fights themselves weren't high level anyway. They were very amateur-esque fights that took place on Eagle FC. I mean, you had the likes of 6-4 guys taking on 3-3 guys in co-main events, and guys who were 5-0 taking on guys who were 19-3 in main events of Eagle FC. It was just really an awful promotion. I don't even know if it's still going on considering the inactivity. Apparently, Khabib's ditched the promotion, which is only going to kill it off even more. But apparently it's still a thing. So Eagle FC is an awful promotion in every aspect, from the competitiveness to just the events themselves, to the consistency. It's an awful MMA promotion which once had a lot of promise, and I thought it was going to be like the next big Dagestanian, you know, I guess Abu Dhabi breeding ground for those type of fighters, but it's an awful promotion. The other awful promotion is going to be Bellator. Now, obviously, Bellator is not really a thing in 2025, but I'm going to be talking about the modern Bellator in the past couple of years of its promotion. Now, Bellator was once a massive kind of competitor to the UFC. We saw these big fights between big names, and it was just a promotion that was putting on these massive fights, and we had these stars like Patchy Mix, Fedor Emelianenko, Patricio Pitbull, but as time went on, all the kind of old washed fighters from the UFC ended up going to Bellator, and Bellator kind of got the reputation for being the home of washed up UFC fighters. Now, obviously, Bellator's now been purchased by PFL, which is why they only had 5 events in 2024, but to be fair to Bellator, to say that PFL's now one of the biggest MMA promotions, when we saw the Bellator versus PFL champion versus champion kind of tournament thing, 5 of the Bellator champions beat 5 of the PFL champions, which is a good sign for Bellator and a bad sign for PFL. But either way, Bellator MMA in its past couple of years, despite once being a massive competitor, the reputation and even just the company as a whole just deteriorated over time, and it turned into what was genuinely an awful promotion, and I'm glad that PFL killed it off and got rid of it. Then for promotions where I'd say people watch this, so I don't think they're useless, I don't think they're terrible promotions, I just can't imagine anyone really tuning into one of these events. The first one we've got is going to be Cage Warriors. Now, Cage Warriors has signed some big names. They've had the likes of Paddy Pimblett, Tom Aspinall and Conor McGregor. Some of Ireland and UK's biggest stars come from this promotion, and they do seem to be fairly consistent, but despite the consistency, nobody watches this. I mean, like I said, they've produced Ian Gary, Nathaniel Wood, Paul Craig, Arnold Allen. I got them two mixed up. But from a competitive standpoint, I mean, Jai Herbert was a champion in Cage Warriors, and he's now a journeyman in the UFC. George Hardwick was a champion in Cage Warriors, and he couldn't even get past the Contender Series. So, Cage Warriors, I do think it's useful. It produces some big names in the UK and in Ireland that can then go on to become a big star in the UFC. So, I think it's a useful promotion. But as far as people tuning into it, no one sits there wanting to tune into a Cage Warriors event. It's not the highest level. It's kind of like the Contender Series for British fighters. And talking of the Contender Series, the next promotion we've got is going to be LFA. Now, LFA is kind of like if the Contender Series was a promotion in itself. It's genuinely the only use of LFA is to build stars and make them have a career in the UFC. We've recently seen Azamat Bekaev, who was a champion in LFA, go on to get a brutal first-round finish in the UFC at UFC 311. We've seen the likes of Gregory Rodriguez, Macy Barber, Brandon Royval, Kevin Holland, and Chris Gutierrez all come from LFA and become a fairly big name in the UFC. And UFC and LFA kind of go hand in hand. The UFC show LFA fights on Fight Pass Pass, which can be massive for LFA when it comes to building themselves from a promotion. And in return, LFA usually just hand out their biggest fighters to the UFC and bend over to the UFC to give them the biggest names. And LFA, no one tunes into the events. No one sits down and watches an LFA event, even if there's no UFC on. But it does have its purposes. It's a good UFC scouting ground. If there's a good prospect in LFA, the UFC might want to keep an eye on them and sign them to the Contender Series maybe. So LFA, useful, but no one watches LFA. No one tunes into the events. It's kind of just there and it does its thing. The next promotion, or the next promotion under this kind of category, is going to be KSW. Now, KSW is one of Europe's biggest MMA promotions, and when I say Europe, I mainly mean Poland. There's been some big UFC stars who have come from KSW. Jan Blachowicz, Mateusz Gamrot, Dricus du Plessis have all come from KSW, and are now big stars in the UFC, so it's kind of just the Cage Warriors of Poland, basically. Same thing about how the Cage Warriors scouts out British and Irish fighters. KSW does the same thing to Polish fighters. The events don't seem to be massive. I guess it is a big promotion in Poland, but outside of Poland, the events don't seem to be making any mainstream traction. So KSW, I'm going to put it in people watch this. I guess it serves its purpose. It makes the Polish happy, but apart from that, it's not a great promotion. And then for the promotions that are good when there's no UFC on. So if UFC's not on for a weekend and these promotions are on, I might tune in. They're genuinely fairly good promotions that have little to critique about them. And when there's no UFC on, they can do their thing. The first one is going to be GFL. Now, GFL actually haven't had their first event yet, and it's kind of been like the new big promotion that has kind of been hyped up in the world of MMA, and it's kind of been hyped up as the home of washed-up big names. Or you thought Bellator was the home of washed-up UFC fighters. Wait till we hear about GFL, when the likes of Frank Mir, Mauricio Hua, OSP, Paige Van Sant, Marlon Moraes, and Alan Belcher are the new signed prospects to this promotion in 2025. You know the state of this promotion. Even the likes of Dylan Dennis, Chad Mendes, and even as of today, Tony Ferguson has been signed to this event. It seems like they've gone through the list of the most washed mixed martial arts fighters in the world who happen to have a big following and just simply signed them to GFL. They've even got this kind of team coaching thing going on. For example, in Los Angeles, you've got Vanderlei Silva as a coach, or as a manager. You've got Ray Longo as a coach in New York. In Dubai, you've got Cain Velasquez and Mendes. And I can just see this being a very kind of promotion where they're taking these big old guys who deserve to be nowhere near an octagon. Not that they don't deserve to be anywhere near an octagon, but they shouldn't be anywhere near an octagon because of their age. And it's going to be essentially grandpas taking each other on. Two, like, just old fighters who shouldn't be anywhere near an octagon, should be in a hospital, if anything, taking each other on in a promotion. But somehow I'm actually interested in GFL, which is why I've put it in. Can be good when there's no UFC on. Like, I might want you want to tune into Rebellious Despain taking on Frank Mir. I might want to see Tyron Woodley take on Luke Rockhold. I might want to see how Greg Hardy does against Andrei Arlovski. They're going to be doing their first GFL draft this Friday. And yesterday's Mike Goldberg, who's going to be involved in GFL draft. I haven't seen him since the early days of the UFC. But either way, GFL, even though it's being clowned up for being the geriatric fight league, I'm actually kind of interested. Like, there's a lot of big names on this promotion, and if they can pull it off, fair play to GFL. The next one is going to be Rizin. Now, Rizin's obviously a massive promotion in Japan. They just signed Kaya Sakura to the UFC. He had that title fight with Pantoja where he got choked out, which isn't a good look for Rizin itself. But I feel like Rizin kind of reminds me of Pride FC because they both take place in a ring. They're both very, like, heavily Japan-based, and they both have a really unique skill set, like kicking a knee into grounded opponents to the body and the head. So it kind of reminds me of Pride FC, which is what I like about Rizin. Some big UFC stars who have come from Rizin is obviously Kaya Sakura. Yuri Prohaska came from Rizin. Manel Cap, Chris Barnett, and Kron Gracie are probably some of Rizin's biggest stars that have come over to the UFC. But it seems to be a solid promotion. They've got a big, like I said before, a big audience in Japan, just like Pred FC has. And they do seem to be fairly consistent as well. They're not like a super inconsistent promotion. They seem to have events a couple times every couple of months. So good when there's no UFC on. I'm going with Rizin. It reminds me of Pride FC. It's kind of like a unique promotion in the sense that, like, the skill set with the knees and the kicks to grounded opponents, to the head and the body. The Japan crowd, where they're more of like a quiet crowd rather than the USA crowd, and just everything that reminds me of Pride. I like Rizin. It's doing its thing, and it's a good promotion when there's no UFC. And the next one we've got is going to be OKTAGON MMA. OKTAGON is selling out these big arenas. It's actually a huge promotion in the world of MMA. It just doesn't really seem to be getting the mainstream media in like the UK and USA, but it's actually a massive promotion. It's very consistent as well. They seem to have a lot of events booked to the point where they've literally got events booked until December 29th of 2025. So they've got nearly every single event booked already for 2025. So they've got, they've got a good plan going on, and they're mainly big in Germany and Czech Republic. That's mainly their big fan base for Octagon. Some UFC fighters who have come from Octagon MMA is Ludovic Klein, Farid Basharat, Felipe Lima, Umar Sy, and Martin Badai. And they've not had terrible runs in the UFC. It's not like they're super uncompetitive when they hit the UFC. They've not gone on to become a champion or anything like that, but they don't seem to be super uncompetitive either. I mean, Lozzi Inquieta is seen to be a massive name in Octagon, and he's 16-1. He seems to be their best fighter. And even if you go through the rankings, number 1 ranked in the middleweight division in Octagon is Makhmud Muradov, who, had a bit of a run in the UFC, had some success, currently making a name for himself. Andres Michalidis, who obviously got knocked out by Alex Pereira, he's now ranked in the middleweight division of Octagon. We've also got the likes of Ivan Butchinger, who got knocked out by Conor McGregor on Cage Warriors. He was a double champion in Octagon. We're also starting to see them dabble in the influencer kind of fighting world. We've seen a comedian take on a reality TV star last year in Octagon MMA as well. But you know what? I can't critique Octagon. They sell out venues. They seem to have a passionate crowd, and there's nothing really bad I can say about it. So good when there's no UFC on is going to be Octagon MMA. The next one I've got is going to be Gamebred Bare Knuckle MMA. It's the most brutal MMA organization in the world. Arguably, as of today, the most brutal kind of mixed martial arts or just combat sports organization in the world. Bare knuckle boxing, it seems to be the new kind of brutal fight sports where the bare knuckle boxing guys go out there and obviously stand and bang. But I think Gamebred MMA is worse because it's mixed martial arts, which is seen as a brutal sport, mixed up with the fact that it's bare knuckle. You can't possibly make this more brutal unless you implement maybe the Pride rules. They've only had a handful of events so far of Gamebred Bare Knuckle, but all of them have been brutal. All of them have had brutal stoppages in it. But again, they do seem to fall into that kind of category of inconsistency. They only had 2 events in 2024, which doesn't help the case. But they've had some big names. Juni Dos Santos versus Fabricio Verdum. Roy Nelson taking on Alan Belcher. Juni Dos Santos versus Alan Belcher. Kevin Lee, Greg Hardy, and Henan Bahau have all been signed to this promotion as well. So the future is uncertain for Gamebred Bare Knuckle MMA. It is an uncertain future because of how inconsistent it is. But if you're asking me to choose between a random MMA promotion and Bare Knuckle MMA, I'm going to watch Bare Knuckle MMA. Regardless of who the promotion is, if I'm getting to see 2 guys go in there and stand and bang in mixed martial arts with no knuckles, the core of brutality, I'm going to watch that over some random MMA promotion. I think if they increase consistency and sign some big names just like GFL, they have some massive potential. So Bare Knuckle MMA, Gamebred Bare Knuckle specifically, it's a good event when there's no UFC on. I hope they do make a comeback. I hope they're not going bankrupt or anything like that, because it's genuinely a promotion that I have a lot of interest in. And the next one is going to be Strikeforce. Obviously, Strikeforce is the OG MMA promotion who produced so many big names in the UFC. Daniel Cormier, one of the greatest of all time. Alistair Overeem, Yoel Romero, Luke Rockhold, Ronda Rousey, Dan Henderson, Chris Cyborg, Nick Diaz, some of UFC's biggest names and some champions that have managed to come from Strikeforce. It was even some of today's guys like Bobby Green has come from Strikeforce, and Anthony Smith too. It was the OG MMA promotion. We've seen some massive fights. Nick Diaz versus Paul Daly, one of the greatest fighters of all time, was in Strikeforce. Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate. Fabricio Verdum versus Fedor Emelianenko. Now, obviously, the last event was in 2013. It's obviously a dead promotion now because it got bought by the UFC. But in its prime, Strikeforce was probably the biggest competitor to the UFC at the time, which is why the UFC had no choice but to really bite in. As far as competitive goes, there's been so many UFC champions, not only champions, but UFC greats who have come from Strikeforce. So it's definitely been one of the best MMA promotions in the world. So Strikeforce is a great alternative to the UFC. And then for promotions that are a UFC competitor, they are competing with the UFC. They're one of the best and one of the top MMA promotions in the world. The first one I've got is ONE FC. Now, I do think ONE FC has kind of fallen off, but despite that, we've had some big fights. Demetrius Johnson, the biggest flyweight star of all time in mixed martial arts, obviously came over to ONE FC, became a champion. And I think a lot of people like the ONE FC rules, which is why they've tuned in. The fact that the weight cuts are less strict, the head kicks and knees to downed opponents to the body and the head, a rule that a lot of people like. The better judging system where they like to score a lot more damage. There's no lay and pray merchants in ONE FC. A lot of people like the rule set in ONE FC, but it has kind of fallen off. Ever since Demetrius Johnson's retired from ONE FC, it's kind of not been doing anything in the world of MMA. It seems like they're massively prioritizing Muay Thai. In terms of Muay Thai, ONE FC are killing it. It's probably the biggest Muay Thai promotion in the world right now, and they're putting on some banging events, but as far as MMA goes, they don't really have any compelling champions. I mean, the heavyweight champion right now in ONE FC would probably get murked by Shamil Gaziev. I think ONE FC as a promotion, really good. ONE FC when it comes to Muay Thai, really good. ONE FC when it comes to MMA, in 2025, not the best, but regardless, it's still a UFC competitor. They seem to have a really good rule set around them. I really like the promotion of ONE FC. I think if they put a little bit more effort and maybe promote the UFC or the MMA base a little bit more, it can be a UFC competitor like it once was. So ONE FC is going to be the first competitor of the UFC. The next one is going to be PFL, which is quite possibly the biggest promotion or the biggest competitor to the UFC right now. I mean, there's been so many stars right now in PFL who could be competitive in the UFC. Dakota Ditcheva, some people think she could beat Shevchenko. She's 14-0 undefeated with 12 knockouts. Usman Nurmagomedov, 18-0, trains with Khabib, is currently going to be taking on Paul Hughes this weekend. Obviously, Francis Ngannou's in PFL as a champion as well. Timur Khizriev, Shamil Musayev, Cedric Doumbé as well. Some big stars in PFL. Now, obviously, one of the biggest critiques for the UFC is the fighter pay. PFL have that unlock, and that's probably why a lot of the fighters in PFL are loyal, because they're giving some of the champions $1 million. Doesn't matter if they're a big star or not. They're giving these $1 million contracts to guys who earn it, which is why a lot of these PFL guys like to stay in PFL. I mean, the guy who got knocked out by Buckley in the UFC won a $1 million contract in PFL. Dakota Ditcheva, if she was in the UFC, she'd probably be making $50K to show up, $50K to win. She won a $1 million contract in PFL. They've had some big fights or big cards as well. PFL versus Bellator was a massive event. Ngannou versus Verheide was a massive event. Paul Hughes versus Usman Nurmagomedov is a big event, and that's going to be taking place this weekend. We've had some great fights, like Dean Garrett versus Lewis McGrillen. Chris Cyborg has had some bangers in PFL as well. Even Yoel Romero's kicking around in PFL these days as well. And a lot of the former Bellator fighters, the biggest stars in Bellator, have kind of had no choice but to go to PFL after PFL bought them. You combine that with the fact that Jake Paul is influencing a lot of the PFL, the fact that he signed to them and he says he's going to fight in them too, and they seem to be having consistent events, and I like the tournament format as well from PFL, which is interesting. It's the biggest UFC competitor in 2024. A lot of people, well, not a lot of people I should say, but some people actually prefer PFL to the UFC. There's a lot of PFL stars who refuse to go over to the UFC because of the strict contract rules and the fact that they're making good money in PFL anyway. So PFL is probably the biggest competitor to the UFC in 2025. And the next one is going to be Pride FC. Some people kind of value Pride FC more than UFC. They think it was a better promotion, and this was just the OG promotions where you could see the likes of Don Fry face 500, 600 pound plus men, where you could see guys just stand and bang, grab each other's heads and punch each other. There was no rules. It's the closest thing you could get to a brutal street fight. It was genuinely the definition of brutality was Pride FC. The rule set, the fact that there was barely any rules as well. Some of the biggest fights in MMA history have taken place in Pride FC. It's a huge promotion. And it was actually bigger than the UFC when they were both kind of going around, when Pride FC was at its best and when the UFC was still around. Pride FC were bigger than the UFC. At the time, UFC had maybe Royce Gracie. Pride FC, they had the likes of Fedor Emelianenko, Vanderlei Silva, Mirko Krokok, Don Fry, Rampage Jackson, Nick Diaz. They had some massive stars, and I think it made MMA one of the most brutal sports in history. Pride FC mixed martial arts might just be the most brutal sport in the history of any sport. Well, maybe not the history, but at least in combat sports, probably the most brutal one. I mean, MMA nowadays is brutal. We've seen some brutal moments these days with both submissions and knockouts, but Pride FC was a completely different level. With the fact that there was no rule set, and there was these big guys going out there, probably, you know, on roids as well. Not probably, but definitely on roids as well. It made it UFC's competitor, and if there was some sort of alternative to Pride FC nowadays, I know we've got the likes of Rizin, but if Pride FC was still competing with the UFC, I genuinely think they'd still be the top MMA promotion in the world. So those are, in my opinion, the biggest competitors with the UFC, and me ranking every promotion outside the UFC. Let me know if you agree, disagree with these takes. Thank you for watching.